and hope you can see it.
Yes, we can, Helena. Thank you.
Good, fine, then I'll start. Our limestone landscape. When Susanne and I talked about this, actually the whole of Öland is a limestone landscape, but we chose to talk about one of the major components in this landscape, which is the Alvars of the Baltic island of Öland. This is what we will talk about tonight. First, I will have a short introduction to Alvars in northeastern Europe. And then I'll talk about the largest Alvar in the world in a little more detail. In Sweden, we call it Stora Alvaret, which means the Great Alvar, if you translate it. And I will also show you the main habitat types we have on Öland, the main Alvar habitat types. Then Susanne will take over and she'll speak about protection and restoration of this unique landscape and what challenges we face. After this, we will have a brief overview of the World Heritage Site on Öland, of which Stora Alvaret is a great part. And then finally, a bit about the Swedish system in the Common Agricultural Policy and how the climate change affects our limestone landscape. And then we hope you have lots of interesting questions for us in the end. Here on this map, you can see where the Alvar habitats can be found in northeastern Europe. And can you see my pointer as well? Yeah. This is where Öland is. It's just off the east coast of the Swedish mainland. And the Alvar areas are, the main distribution of them are on the Baltic islands, Öland, Gotland in Sweden, and also the Estonian islands, Dagö, Ösel, and Muhu. There are also small areas on the Swedish mainland and also on the Estonian mainland. As you can see, the limestone bedrock on Öland is mainly from the Ordovician area, and it's about 460 million years old. Gotland and most of Estonia, on the other hand, have younger Silurian bedrocks. At least in Sweden, we have a definition of Alvars, and that's, of course, that the bedrock should be limestone. The soil cover is thin or it's even absent, because in many places we have the bedrock is visible. The water availability is extremely fluctuating. It can be dry for several months during summer, and during spring and autumn it can be flooded for several weeks. And usually we add this about that it should have been through the latest ice age, but that's just so you can be able to compare flora and fauna with other areas, because we've only had 12,000 years of evolution on the Alvar, which can't be compared with other areas that hasn't been iced. And this, the map here shows the distribution of Alvars on Öland. The largest part that we'll talk the most of is Stora Alvaret, which is this big area in the southern third of the island. In total, we have about 33,000 hectares of Alvar habitats on Öland, and it's about the same on Gotland, but they are more scattered. To understand our limestone landscape and the species that inhabit it, we need to know a bit about the historic processes that shaped it. So I will now spend a few minutes to take you through the latest 12,000 years on Öland. The first parts of Öland were free from the ice or seawater about 12,500 years ago. And as you can see to the left, the a large part of Öland was already above sea level around 11,000 years ago. But it took almost 10,000 years, another 10,000 years before the island had the same shape as it has today. The first period after the ice retreated is called pre-boreal. That was 10,000 years ago when the climate was cold and it was dry. And the earliest habitat was a steppe tundra, probably pretty much like the vegetation we still can see on parts of the Alvar on Öland. And I will come back to that. Pollen from Öland rock rose, Helianthemum ölandicum, wormwoods, Artemisia, grasses, but also junipers and the first trees, which were birch and pine, has been found from this period. During the next period, the boreal period, it got warmer and the landscape was more or less covered with dense forests. And in these forests, it was mainly deciduous trees, deciduous tree species. Then we have the Atlantic period that started 8,000 years ago. The forest was still very dense and even more deciduous tree species in there. And it was even warmer than the boreal period, around 2 to 4 degrees warmer than today. And some of the new arrivals among the plants were ivy and mistletoe, and they were very common because it was a humid climate here. And at this time, there were a lot of browsers like aurochs, mooses, and red deer, and they shaped the landscape to some extent. The climate during the subboreal period was cooling, but it was still warmer than it is today. And from this period, we find the first traces of humans, cereals, which are an evidence of cultivation, and also Plantago lanceolata, ribwort plantain, which shows that there has been pastures, grazing land. And to find pollen in these layers, the species has to be really common, otherwise it's really hard to detect. The last period, which we in fact are still in, is called subatlantic, and it started about 5 years ago. Here the climate was extremely variable. The wetlands increased, the tree line advanced southwards, and of course humans were affecting the landscape. They were clearing the landscape increasingly. And there were large variation in the climate from the 13th century and onwards, and there were droughts, floodings, and famine, and problem to cope in these climate variations. And there was a really cold period between 1350 and 1850, which is often called the Little Ice Age. So now I think we are ready for the present, the Alvars at present. The Stora Alvaret, the Great Alvar, as I said earlier, it's this southern part of the island. It's the largest Alvar in the world, and it's about 26,000 hectares. It has been open, that is without trees and bushes, at least by 60% since the latest ice age, I should say. And that's of course because 60% of the soil cover is too thin for trees and bushes to be able to establish. It consists of a mosaic of habitats depending on soil depth and water availability. And of course, it's a high diversity of flora and fauna. Here. The main use of Stora Alvaret has been grazing land since the early Stone Age, at least 5,000 years. There has been a very varying degree of encroachment depending on how large the human population was and how much livestock they had. And it was most intensely used around the birth of Christ, year 0, and during the 19th century. And during these periods, there were probably not very few bushes and trees, and an extremely open landscape, because there were so many people living on the island at that time. There was a major historical event which was endured for quite a long time between 1569 and 1801, because in 1569 the Swedish king decided that all outlying land, that is everything except arable fields, hay meadows and villages, so all the forests or grazing lands or everything should be reserved for the crown so they could hunt game. And all trees belonged to the crown, and you couldn't even break branches, or you couldn't even harvest the leaves for fodder. And the farmers couldn't defend the fields against wild animals because they were not allowed to carry arms, because they shouldn't shoot the wild game, and because that was for the king. And the deer and wild boar did severe damage to the crops, of course, because they couldn't, it was hard to stop them. But the farmers were allowed to graze the land, but at this time there weren't any stone walls or fences, so there were shepherds herding the flocks of cattle and sheep mainly. But there were also many horses at this time, but they were out more or less wild on the Alvar in flocks all year round. The farmers also were allowed to harvest bushes, because they used that for fuel, for firewood, along with cow dung, because they couldn't use the trees, so they really needed everything they could use as fuel. And these claims of the crown weren't abandoned until 1801. And after the land was divided and after 1801, the land was divided and given back to the farmers, and because before the crown owned it. And the many stone walls we can see in the Alvars today were built after 1819, when this land division was completed. It took some years because before it was completed. I earlier mentioned that it is a mosaic of different habitats, and this is a vegetation map of the central part of Stora Alvaret. And just to show you the mosaic, you can see the scale down here. So it's really a lot of different habitats here. And I will now try to describe the main habitats in the Alvar. I start out with the limestone pavement. It covers about 2% of Stora Alvaret. For those of you who are familiar with the Natura 2000 codes, I put them within the brackets, but that's just if you're especially interested. In the limestone pavement, there is no soil cover, or it's only a few centimeters thick. It's mainly cushions of mosses, where succulent plants or annual plants can grow when they get wet. In this habitat, it can be dry for several months during the summer, and during mainly autumn, but also during spring, it can be flooded for several weeks. So this is really a harsh environment to live in, but still quite a lot of species do. Here are some of the species. I won't talk about all of them. I will just mention a few of them. For example, the blue-winged grasshopper here. Sphingomyzus cerulans, which is today has a Siberian distribution. There is also Hutchinsia. Oops, sorry. I was going to point. Honungia petrea, which is now found mainly around the Mediterranean. So this is a relic from the temperate periods, the earlier warmer periods. And we also have Poa alpina, the alpine meadowgrass, which is a glacial relict. And these species can be found side by side in this habitat, which is quite fascinating, I think. Then we have the karst, which you have a lot of in Burren, I think, which can be, it's less than 1%, so it's not very common, and it can be distinguished from the limestone pavement by that the fissures are open. They are not in the limestone pavement, they are full of vegetation, but here they are open, which creates a different microclimate because it's cooler and more humid down in the fissures than on the surface. And here are some of the species. Again, we can find Mediterranean species like the scorpion senna, Hippocrepis emerus. And there are also quite a lot of ferns in these fissures, like the Alpan woodsia, Woodsia alpina, wallrue, and maidenhair spleenwort. And we can also find species that we usually find in groves and forests, like Hepatica nobilis, the blue anemone, I think you call it. The most common habitat on the Alvar is what we call gravel Alvar. And we call it that because it's never totally covered with vegetation. The pollen findings from the border period I earlier talked about indicate that this might be what the steppe tundra after the ice age could have looked like, because the species here are the same as the one found in the pollen analysis, like Helianthemum elandicum, wormwoods, and grasses. The soil cover here is really thin, and it consists of pure weathering material from the limestone bedrock, so it's very basic. And in this habitat during winter, there are really heavy frost movements in the thin soils, and it makes it impossible for the vegetation to cover the whole area. And this, of course, along with the limestone pavement, has never been forested, and neither has the limestone pavement, as I said, because it's not possible for bushes and trees to grow in this habitat. The dominating species on the picture here is this Öland rock rose, Helianthemum ölandicum, which in fact is endemic to Öland. That means that it doesn't occur any other place in the world. Here are some of the species. We have, for example, another endemic, Galium ölandicum. It's Öland bedstraw, I guess you can call it. Again, we have species that from the warmer periods and that now occur around the Mediterranean, like Gypsophila fastigiata, time broom rape, which is a parasite, and Globularia vulgaris. They are all relics from warmer times, whereas these two lichens, Thamnolia vermicularis and Cetraria nivalis, are glacial relics, which we today can find in the mountains, in the Swedish mountains at least. And also represent the spectacular rose-winged grasshopper that's also now today has a Siberian distribution. So north and east and south. The dry calcareous grasslands covers about 15%. These are extremely species-rich grasslands. In a plot of 10 by 10 centimeters, we have found 23 different vascular plant species, 1 square decimeter. These have a bit deeper soils, but it's not, I mean, it's 1 or 2 meters maximum. So, but we think they are deep compared to the other Alvar habitats. They get overgrown by bushes and trees if they aren't grazed. And some of the species, there are quite a lot of orchids in this habitat. For example, early purple orchid, and this species, I don't think you have it in England or Ireland, but it's we call it Adam and Eve in Swedish, Dactylorhiza sambucina, and burnt orchid are some of the species you can find here. We also have another endemic, Artemisia ölandica, a wormwood species. Moist calcareous grasslands, 17%, quite a lot of those. They are also, of course, dependent on grazing. They get overgrown mainly with shrubby cinquefoil, Dasyphora fruticosa, and birch. And here we have the Dasyphora fruticosa, the shrubby cinquefoil, which is a circumpolar species that has a distribution around the North Pole. And it even has an endemic little moth. It's endemic to Öland, this moth called Coleophora peri, which has this Dasyphora as its host plant. There is also a common species in this habitat, it's Primula farinosa, bird's eye primrose. And on Öland and Gotland, we have this special form, as you can see at the bottom here. The flowers, they don't have a stem like this flower has. And that is thought to be an adaptation to a continuous grazing for a long time, because it's not so easy for the cattle to eat them when they are so short. The alkaline fens, they aren't so common, and they share many of the species with the moist calcareous grasslands I talked about earlier. Well, I could mention the fly orchid, which occurs here, Ophrys insectifera, which has a special scent. It has the same scent as the females of the wasp, a wasp called Argorogytes in Latin. So a male wasp lands here and thinks he's mating with a female, but he's in fact pollinating the orchid instead. There is also a carnivorous plant, butterwort, which captures insects on its sticky leaves. Temporary pools are water bodies that dry out in summer. They are really shallow. And I'm just going to mention one of the species here, which is really interesting. That's Triops cancriformis, the tadpole shrimp, which is the oldest now living species in the world. There have been fossils that are 250 million years old that look the same. So they survived the dinosaurs and very many others. And finally, the Alvar lakes, which are the deeper pools that they hold water the whole year around, even in summer. And they are really nutrient poor, but highly calcareous. And the bottoms of these lakes are usually covered with stoneworts, Cara species, these algae here. So now over to Susanne and how we protect and restore this mosaic landscape.
Thank you, Helena. So, I'm talking about the protection and the restoration of the Stora Alvaret area. The use of Stora Alvaret for grazing began in the early Stone Age. The grazing animals and people collecting shrubs for fuel created this steppe-like landscape. Here you can see rows of large stones in the surface. They are remnants of stone walls from the Iron Age. And we have a lot of remnants from the Iron Age, especially house remains and also this from old pastures. The new ones, they are less than 200 years, as you know now. Nobody gets the fireworks. Helena, you have to change the picture. Thank you. Nobody gets the firewood from Alvar any longer. And from 1950 until 1995, year by year, new large areas of Alvar were left without grazing. The Alvar land is nutrient poor and the production is very low. The farmers have enough of better, more productive grasslands for production of meat and milk today. Here in the southern of Öland, especially the coastal near grasslands, we find them especially along the eastern coastline of the island, and you can see the villages along the road on the back, and in the center of the island, far back on the picture, you see the brownish area. That's the Stora Alvaret. In the beginning of the 90s, the Kalmar County Administrative Board started negotiations with landowners to protect parts of Stora Alvaret. The first large nature reserve were established in 92. This did not stop the negative trend. At the aerial photo, you can see if Helena give me another picture. Helena. Thank you. Here on this picture, you can see to the right, an open, hard sheep grazed area, and to the left, an area for a long time without grazing. Today is it cattle grazing there. So next picture. Since 95, Sweden is a member of EU, and since then there is an agri-environmental program for Sweden, 50% finance from the European Commission. What prevented farmers to become a part of the program from start was, for example, lack of grazing animals, collapsing stone walls, and no other fences were there. Though overgrown Alvar was the most common reason. Junipers are spreading on the deeper dry soils where birch and Dasyphora fruticosa, the yellow flowering bush, are invading moister soils. The schemes did not pay for restoration of pastures at that time, which meant that the grazing land had to be in good condition before entering the program. Shrub clearance and more widespread grazing was urgently needed to recreate open, dry, and moist Alvar grasslands. By protecting Alvar as nature reserves and proposing them as Natura 2000 sites, it was possible to finance this important work, partly with Life Nature Foundation and partly by Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and the Kalmar County Administration. 1996, the LIFE project, Protection and Restoration of Parts of Stora Alvaret, started. The project was one of the first large ones in Sweden, LIFE projects, and it included about 30% of Stora Alvaret, almost 8,000 hectares. The project made it possible to repair and erect new fences around large grazing lands. Many pastures here are 500 to 1,000 hectares, and they are common grazing land for a whole village. During the LIFE project, the agri-environmental measures paid for the grazing and the project for fencing and clearing. In Sweden, the county administrative board is the authority that manage protected areas like Natura 2000 sites. Still, most of the land and the protected lands are private owned, and it always must be done the work together and in cooperation with the landowners. Usually the farmers, the landowners, graze and apply for the environmental measures. But if the landowner doesn't have livestock or doesn't want to clear, we, the county administrative board, can contract an entrepreneur for the job. 1994, less than 60% of Stora Alvaret was grazed, and large areas with too little cattle to keep the land open. After a few years, there was a massive change, and since more than 10 years, all of the area is grazed. The first LIFE project was focused mainly on dry orchid-rich grasslands and alvar habitats. The second one focused on coastal meadows, wet grasslands and alkaline fens. This time they were spread all over the island, not only on Stora Alvaret. Most actions were actually done in the coastal areas. Even these parts are part of the limestone landscape, as you heard Helena tell you about. They have high cultural and botanical and ornithological values. Here we still find the largest population of wader birds in the Baltic region. One of the most threatened is the southern subspecies of dunlin, Calidris alpina chinzi, which has also a small population at Stora Alvaret, not only on the coastal meadows. Some results of the two LIFE project was what you can see here in the figure. Almost 4,000 hectares were grazed again. More than 2,000 hectares were cleared, and over 6,000 hectares were protected as nature reserves. And by the year of 2000, all of Stora Alvaret area and most of the coastal near grasslands, 10,000 hectares, so to say, went Natura 2000 sites. Today, restoration and management of these protected areas are done by colleagues at the Nature Management Unit at the County Administrative Board. Hundreds of hectares have been cleared, wetlands are restored, and monitoring of habitats and species are going on. And all information, places, paths, gates, and styles have to be maintained. You can see on this air photo, the work going on in September, the extremely dry year of 2018. It was an alvar lake, at this time totally dry, and it was overgrown with Carex elata and the Salic species. And we, together with a farmer who didn't have any water to his cattle anymore, we tried to restore this alvar lake. 2 months later, it looked like this, when the rain finally had come. And I will come back to the climate change and after Helena has told you something about the World Heritage Site.
Yes. We need to speed on here, time flies. So I will be very short just to mention that the Stora Alvaret is a major part of the World Heritage Site, the agricultural landscape of southern Öland, which was inscribed on the World Heritage List in the year 2000. And the first criterion is about the land use. Man has had as we have said several times, has had livestock since early Stone Age, and so the pastures have been grazed more or less for 5,000 years. The second criterion is about the land division, that is the same since the Middle Ages, so it's about 1,000 years old, because by then all land that could be cultivated was cultivated. And so the land was divided, as I said before, the outlying land, which was the grazing land, the infield, which were cultivated land and hay meadows, and then the villages, the three parts. So all these, the whole system is a World Heritage Site. And of course, Stora Alvaret is the main reason for this, because this land cannot be used for anything else than grazing. It's a cultural landscape. It's a continuing cultural landscape, since the natural sites has to be more or less untouched by man. To be inscribed on the World Heritage List, it requires that the locals they agree that to the application. And on Öland, the farmers even voted for this, so it was really democratically handled. And there were lots of information meetings, and a part of, a key factor to the success of this was that we were the persons at the county, the three of us at the county administration working with this, as well as the LIFE project, we were together. We had a competence in biology, nature conservation, cultural history, and agriculture. So together we knew really a lot. And after the inscription, a local World Heritage Council was formed, and it consists of representatives from the county administration, from the municipality, and also from the Swedish Federation of Farmers. And they have regular meetings to discuss different, important issues concerning the area. And currently there is a lot of discuss and in this matter. So Susanne will tell you a little bit more of that, our challenges.
Yes, thank you. Primarily cattle, but also horses and sheep graze Stora Alvaret today. The level of grazing pressures nowadays is mainly settled by the agri-environmental measures, not any longer by local tradition inherited from father to son, and not from the management plans for the protected areas. The objective should have been to find a level that ensure optimum conditions for the habitats and species for which the sites are designated. I'm sorry to say that is not always the case. Due to the environmental measures, all grazing land have to be open and well grazed to get the payment. And the next picture, the farmers are afraid of not grazing enough for entitled to the agri-environmental support. This is a big part of their income, especially farmers with cattle for meat. This makes some areas overgrazed, but still other parts are overgrowing. Clearing is very resource intensive, especially if it shall be done in a careful way not to disturb the fragile habitats. The county administration manage the more threatened habitats like karst and alkaline fens in cooperation with the farmers, but there is so much work to do. At Alvar, one cattle needs 5 to 10 hectares for grazing. If you compare that with the coastal land, 1 hectare can feed 1 cattle. It would be desirable to be able to change grazing regimes when needed in cooperation with the farmers. Monitoring should be of plants and insects, for example, should be a help to decide the grazing regime besides the local traditions. It is desirable with less livestock in some areas, more in others, and sometimes a combination of cattle and horse or sheep, like it used to be for 200 years ago, should be good. The only possibility to keep livestock on Alvar today and in the future is to compensate the farmer for the lower production and for all the costs by managing the area. Besides milk and meat, they nowadays produce natural and cultural values well worth to pay for. The regulation in the amount of EU-financed environmental support changes every 5th year and sometimes in between. At the moment, all bush, tree and bare limestone areas larger than 0.1 hectare are taken away from subsidies. And in this flat, vast area, it is hard for the farmer to know what is in the program and what is not. Sometimes they are happy if they do not get subsidies for an area, then they don't have to clear it. But who will? Something else that worries us is the short-term planning for nature conservation, since the finances is 1 year at the time. The politicians decide the amount of funding for nature conservation. Our current government values nature conservation, thus the grants are high now, but there will soon be a new election and then the conditions can be changed very quickly. And as you understand, to conserve and manage the Alvar, it's very hard and long-term ongoing work, and it will never end. Another threat is climate change. This photo from September 2018 shows dry water streams and dead junipers, the brown dots you see. Drought the last 3 years and low groundwater level even longer worries both farmers and biologists. The dry Alvar land can't feed the cattle anymore. Many farmers have increased their livestock, moved them to fields already in August, or even kept them indoors. They are forced to feed them with what should have been the winter fodder, and many farmers must buy and run for water from far. Some have even gone bankrupt. Habitats change we have seen so far is, for example, massive die-off of grasses. This year, we started a collaboration with the farmer organization. We are looking for possibilities to make the Alvar recover from drought and overgrazing, for example, by restoring more wetlands and to let the Alvar land rest from grazing, to recover the fragile habitats and species, of course. Though it is important that the farmers are not too negatively affected by this. If we reconnect to the World Heritage Site, the official description says that people through the history have adapted their way of living to the physical conditions of the landscape. The climate change seems to affect the conditions. We must learn how to adapt to new circumstances. The real challenge we have now is how to conserve the changing limestone landscape. Yes, thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Helena and Susanne. I think that was really fantastic. And the last image is a one which is very familiar to me because I'll always remember the windmills and the stone circles in Öland and the villages as well, which are quite unique.
The windmill is for you, Brendan.
So, as well as the beautiful plants, there's lots of really interesting cultural heritage as well. So thank you both. That was fascinating, really well presented and really relevant, I think, to the Burren. I was just struck by the fact that the area of the Stora Alvaret is pretty similar to Burren here in terms of the protected area of the Burren would be about just over 30,000 hectares as well, so similar in extent. And it's lovely as well to see so many familiar plant species, a lot of the orchids, the fly orchid and the frog orchid and the fragrant orchid, the fine broomrape, lots of old friends, and lots of parallels in terms of the management challenges as well. I note your stone walls, but I also note the sort of the ebb and flow of farming activity in the area and the challenges that it presents. I think what's particularly interesting is what you finished on, Susanne, is the whole notion of protecting for the longer term in a way that engages the local community. And I'm very interested in the World Heritage Site. There's a lot of questions and comments, so I just wanted a couple for myself, maybe before we move on. Well, with regard to climate change, is fire a problem? Wildfire?
No.
Okay, good.
Or do you want to answer, Susanne? No,
I
we
didn't
have
hear
very little.
I'm going to put on so I will hear you better, I hope.
I was just wondering, given the very, very dry, extended dry period you've had, whether or not wildfires are a problem now or a problem that you're concerned about in future.
There's been very few on Öland. There were many on the mainland in the forests, but on Öland we haven't had any yet, and particularly not on the Alvar. So
the second question I kind of wanted, maybe Susanne or Helena as well. The World Heritage Site, really interesting. I know the Burn here is on the tentative list of World Heritage Sites for similar on similar criteria and the relationship between people and place. How has that relationship been impacted by the presence of the World Heritage Site? Is there more tourism? Is within the farming community or the local community, is it seen as been positive initiative, or has it been seen as something negative?
Overall, I think it's positive, but if to attract tourists, you have to have something to offer, and there hasn't been so much creativity among the farmers. I mean, some farmers they sell their strawberries and say that it's strawberries from the World Heritage Site of Öland, and those strawberries they sell much better than the other strawberries that are grown in the adjacent field, but there hasn't been. I mean, there is a lot you could do to attract tourists more, but I guess it has increased a bit, but probably not as much as it could, because as I said, we must have something to offer for the tourists as well.
There are some guides. They have guided tours on Alvar, and they bring food from the region and so on. And there is the ecological station. They have a lot of activities, and also a lot of tourists are going there. I was thinking about the hembygdsföreningarna.
Well, the small organizations for the parishes. Every parish has a small organization working with the parish heritage, so to say.
And they have organized every year a week in August, which is the World Heritage Week, with a lot of small activities. But still, after 20 years now, I'm a little sad that not more has happened. I thought it should have meant more, but I think the farmers, they have not time to take care of the farmers, of the tourists. So, but
okay.
then there happened something new. So.
Thanks for that. Before I hand back to Prancha, just one question from Newfoundland, from Louise, who will be speaking to us in the new year. Are there any specific programs for endangered plants or animals to ensure that they aren't extirpated or lost?
Yeah, several. We have a lot. We have some these national action plans for several of the species, and we get extra grants. We get grants that we can use for these threatened species. So there is a lot of work being done, and also the monitoring that Susanne was talking about is also a way of seeing when they are declining. So if it's needed and any actions are needed. Yes.
Okay. Pranjali, if you want to come in with a few questions.
Thank you, Helena and Susan. I just want to say that we have about 90 people tuning in this evening. So thank you everyone for joining us. I think it's been fabulous participation, lovely comments from people from all over Ireland, as well as Wales and Norway. So lots of interest out there in what you had to say. I have one question of my own before I take one from the audience. Do you have any seasonal movement of the stock, the cattle, across the landscape from a seasonal point of view between winter and summer? Is there much change in the way the land is grazed?
No, we don't have it, not like in Ireland, for example. The cattle or all livestock come out end of April, beginning of May, and they stay out until end of October. This year, some are out even now because it's warm and the grass is still growing. That's very seldom here. And then they keep them indoors during the winter. Okay. So all cattle and sheep and horses are inside during the winter.
Okay. There's a really good question here from Rory. Hi, Susanne and Helena. That was a really wonderful presentation. How important do you think open public access to the Alvar of Öland has been to secure ongoing funding for agri-environmental payments?
I think it's really important, and the last years, or the last 20 years since the World Heritage Site, it's a lot of new paths and roads you can take by horse or by foot or even by bicycle over the area. So there is a good public way to come in the area. I think it's important that people can come there and see it and understand how important it is with grazing. I think that's for the future, it's really important that people know how much work the farmers are doing and how important it is with grazing.
There's one more question from Andy Bleasdale. Thanks for your very interesting presentations. I was lucky enough to visit the Alvars in 2000s and saw the fabulous habitats up close. How are the Alvars managed as part of the wider farming system, which includes more intensively managed lands? Does farming the Alvar make sense from a farming perspective, not just from nature conservation point of view?
As I showed, all of Stora Alvaret is grazed today, but of course a lot of farmers would take the livestock away if they don't get then the payment, the measures from the environmental measures. It's a lot of money for the farmers, and they really need it to use this low productive area. And it's hard to keep the cattle out there. It's some hundreds hectares every farmer has, and they need to look after the cattle almost every day. So it's hard work they do.
And the Alvar wouldn't be grazed without the environmental measures. We can be quite sure of that, because it's, as Susanne said, it's too much work to do it.
Well, the pictures look fascinating, and there's loads of participants who want to visit.
So great! Welcome. Yeah.
Brenton, we probably don't have time for any. Do you want to have a final word?
One very last quick question.
Yeah, show the last picture with our.
One very last quick question from Stephen Ward, an old friend of Burnbio. I can't but ask his question. It's about the World Heritage Site as well, because I think. I guess the question is, the designation does not appear to be being used to attract new government funding to manage the site. Is that true? In the sense of, I guess the World Heritage Site designation is all about protecting the heritage. And from what you say, Susanne and Helena, there's still challenges with regard to the engagement of the community and the sustainability of the agri-environmental funding. So from that point of view, has the World Heritage Site managed to attract additional funding or help the conservation of the heritage?
Well, the World Heritage isn't a protection actually, but of course we have a responsibility since it's inscribed on the World Heritage list, and we report to UNESCO every 6 years, and just to show that we still have the values we have presented and things like that. But and there aren't any special grants for World Heritage sites, but of course, when it is a World Heritage site, it could be easier to get grants, if you understand what I mean. That so it can, because a World Heritage site is of course very important, and it must, maybe the ones who give the grants are more prone to give us grants when it's a World Heritage site.
And Susanne, last word to you. Are you optimistic for the future of the Stora Alvaret?
Yes, I have to be. Yes, I am. And we have seen a lot of these habitats and species are adapted to dry climate. So I really hope they will survive, and I think they will. And we really hope it will be raining this summer coming.
Well, listen, thank you both. I'm not sure if Pranjal has anything to add, but it's been a really wonderful talk, and it's exactly what we had in mind when we planned this talk series, a little insight into other limestone landscapes around the world and the management challenges and some of the solutions. So you've been really wonderful in that regard. I think our next speaker is the wonderful Nika Debitic from Slovenia.
No, actually, Brenton, I just looked, it's actually Yorkshire, UK next month
okay.
9th of December with Helen Keep. Yeah.
Helen is here tonight on the call as well. I think we've Nika in the new year. So Helen, we're looking forward to hearing from you next month. And Pranjali, over to you. Thank you both, and thank to everybody who showed up tonight. And Pranjali, maybe the last word to you.
Yes, thank you, Susanne and Helena. It's really late for you, and thank you for coming in to talk to us. I know it's we are 1 hour ahead, so you're probably ready for bed, but we really appreciate you taking the time and presenting your story to us tonight. So to all our attendees, have a very good night, and we'll see you on the second Wednesday of December, 8 o'clock on 9th of December for to learn about limestone landscape in Yorkshire, UK. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
Thank you both.